So I guess we can start now. Thank you all for all of you for being here with us today. I would like to welcome you all and our dear panelists. The title of this first academic panel is The EU as a Civil Military Crisis Manager. My name is Marina Kostić. I am Secretary General of the Professional Association of Security Sector, and previously I worked in the Ministry of Defense on the issues of European integration and regional initiatives. I would also like to send greetings to my colleagues, Maja Ružić and Marko Kovačević, who will be moderator in the next two academic panels, and to send greetings to the students of Faculty of Political Sciences that are watching us now. Now I will represent our panelists. First panelist is Katarina Đokić. She is researcher at the Belgrade Center for Security Policy, and she will tell us something about civil-military synergies in the EU conflict prevention and peace building. She did a comparative analysis of the EU civil-military synergies in the Western Balkans and the Horn of Africa. Our second panelist is Benjamin Zyla. He is Associate Professor in the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa and also Senior Fellow at the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy. He will present us his article titled Improving the Effectiveness of EU Crisis Management at the Civil-Military Nexus. He will say something more about how well the EU crisis management tools and instruments are applied in a comprehensive manner. I must say, I just choose the most important things from your biographies, and if you want, you can also present something more. Our third panelist is Gabriëlla Vogelaar. She is a project coordinator at the EU-funded Horizon 2020 project, Whole of Society Conflict Prevention and Peace Building, and her article for this panel is Civil-Military Synergies in the EU External Action. She asked the question, can more inclusive and consistent approaches strengthen the EU credibility as a peace-building and conflict manager actor? Finally, our fourth panelist is Cristian Barbieri. He's junior researcher in the Security and Defense program at the Institute for International Affairs in Rome. Hello, his paper for this forum is Dual Use, Support to Conflict Prevention and Peace Building, the case of RPAS and satellites. I will not ask who knows what it is, but I expect from our panelists to explain it. So Cristian worked as an intern at the EULEX mission within the strengthening division at the EU CSDP mission EULEX Kosovo. And our discutant today is Mr. Pieter Feith. He is senior mediator with the European Institute of Peace in Brussels, and he is also known here for his role in the preventive diplomacy and peace building in southern Serbia and Kosovo. So I would like again to welcome you all, and I would like to propose, because of your topics, to have ladies first. So Katarina, and then Gabriëlla, and then Mr. Benjamin. So, Katarina, please take the floor.
Thank you. What I would like to do here is present research and preliminary findings currently carried out by my colleagues Peter Hornet-Sazdal from Roskilde University and Savannah Simons from Transparency Solutions in the framework of EU CivCap project presented already by Ms. Sonja Stojanović-Gajić. Now, as you could hear, our research is on civil-military synergies in the EU external action, or more precisely crisis management, and what we aim to do at this panel is to share our process, instigate dialogue about research, and benefit from your comments and suggestions. Now let's start with civil-military synergies as such. Some of you may be wondering, after all the other terms such as civil-military cooperation, security development nexus, comprehensive approach, what on earth are they doing introducing something new such as civil-military synergies? Well, to be honest, it's not us, it's the EU. So basically, what we found challenging is that this is a novel concept, closely tied to CSDP, basically developed as one of its aims, with its foundational policy laid back in 2009, And it's a practitioner's term, so it's not a theoretic a concept developed in theory, and as such it's even more fluid, very much catch-all, and honestly, even the EU does not have a proper nominal definition of this term. What it has is an implicit definition suggesting that civil-military synergies aim at strengthening operational capabilities, and also that civil-military synergies should ensure efficient use of resources in conditions of economic restraints. This is one way to observe civil-military synergies as efficient use of resources. Another way could be found by analyzing comprehensive approach and its requirements for mobilizing different strengths, resources, and also for increased cooperation with international partners in the field. And in this sense, civil-military synergies the term refers to effectiveness or impact increases. So these are two dimensions of the term which basically suggest that what the EU means is not coordination, it's not cooperation between civil-military actors and instruments. Those are their outputs, and this is what we want to observe. And in this way, we also wanted to move beyond the current body of literature, which is basically focused on examining cooperation, coordination of civil-military synergies, and trying to examine their outputs. So basically, our research question is, to which extent do civil-military synergies exist in practice? What forms could be found, and what potential civil-military synergies are there? What civil-military synergies, or in what way civil-military synergies could be enhanced, with the last question being particularly policy relevant. Having said that, after we had started our field research, we actually came to the point where our primary research question was, do civil-military synergies exist at all? Having this exploratory research in sight, we set very clear, nice analytical framework, very simple, with three main pillars. First, identifying formal mechanisms for establishing or producing civil-to-military synergies. Secondly, identifying informal or ad hoc civil-military synergies which might have been attained in practice so far. And the third one, identifying potential civil-military synergies. Our research method is case study, and we opted for the most similar design and selected Western Balkans and the Horn of Africa as case studies, whereas I have to underline that so far our findings for the Western Balkans are limited to Kosovo. So obviously these two cases are very different. We deal with different political, economic, social, cultural contexts, also different stages of conflicts and different combinations of the EU civil and military instruments used in the field. For instance, whereas the EU has both civil and military missions in Somalia, in Kosovo the case is such that the EU only has the rule of law executive civilian mission, EULEX, while military presence is provided by NATO, which was also super interesting to look at because NATO EU members, vast majority, are the same states. And the EU as such recognizes that it has a single set of forces which could be applied in different frameworks. So it was very interesting to observe to which extent civil-military synergies were established at this interagency level. Let me just shortly present our preliminary findings. Obviously, we came to learn that there were significant differences between the two cases, but what is important is that there are some findings which I have in common. And the first one is relations between civil and military instruments and missions are formalized through mandates, policies, calling for missions to establish coordination and cooperation with other missions and international actors working in the field, also through vast interface involving regular coordination meetings, exchange of liaison officers. In the case of Somalia, for instance, synergy between EUCAP civilian capacity, maritime capacity building mission and EU military training mission is already attained by the fact that the two are co-located. Having said that, whereas the formal mechanisms exist, they do not necessarily guarantee that civil-military synergies will be attained. And so far we have a case where we can recognize that we do have sort of vessels, but civil-military synergies are still not flowing. And in Somalia, there are very limited instances of civil-military synergies which mostly have to do with overlapping mandates. While in Kosovo, I would say that civil-military synergies are very limited to occasional instances rather than anything that I would dare to describe as practice. What also corroborates these preliminary conclusions is the fact that we haven't been able so far to observe any major examples of informal ad hoc attained civil-military synergies. So logically, the next step in our research was to ask why this is the case and try to identify factors contributing to this. And what we managed to register so far, firstly, international actors working in the fields are very much focused on their narrow mandates and not really, going to work, doing their day-to-day job and not really looking left or right or trying to see the big picture and to see how a combination of efforts could actually be both efficient and effective. Second, they are not incited to do so, and they are not really directed to do so because more precise operational guidelines is missing. And for instance, what would be good is to have concrete examples of or domains of civil-military synergies which should be attained and we should be part of particular mission mandate, but at this moment this is not the case. Third major problem is a lack of autonomy of heads of missions, and very much they are very much forced to wait for authorization from Brussels for every small deviation from the mandate or every relocation of resources. And let me just give you one illustration. Somalia 2017. Massive draft response efforts coordinated by UN Office for the Coordination of International Assistance. EUCAP, Nestor, EUTM have solid resources which could be applied, but they are not used timely, and they are not, at the end of the day, they are not particularly useful at all. It's mostly the African Union mission which deploys its relatively scarce and modest resources in these efforts. So these three things, narrow mandates, lack of incentive for decision makers to think broadly, and inflexibility of the missions leads to the fact that you have to ask substantial questions. What's the point of having a EU mission in the field if it can't respond to the most burning security challenge at that point? And finally, one interesting thing that we found is that there is a clear delineation between civil and military when it comes to capacity building. And for instance, there is an interesting case in the Western Balkans where you have, for instance, in Kosovo, few actors working with Kosovo security forces. But I mean, this is the case in Serbia as well with MOD and so far, and etc. And the European Union, on the other hand, for instance, having rule of law as clear priority with its enlargement policy, and one of the basic things of the rule of law is anti-corruption. But anti-corruption trainings for the armed forces are delivered only by certain actors which do not have red lines such as the EU to work with the armed forces. And there is no pooling and sharing of capabilities. And it was only 2016 that the joint declaration of the EU and NATO recognized and remembered, hey, we could actually, since we are doing pretty much the same things, we could actually, put capacity building as one of the explicit goals and areas where we could actually, pool and share resources and establish more substantial cooperation. So these are our major findings. I thank you for your attention and look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Thank you, Katarina, for staying in time for this 10 to 12 minutes. I forgot to say that all the panelists will have 10 to 12 minutes to present their academic papers. And after that, we will have half an hour for you to have some questions, if you have them. So I would like to ask Ms. Vogelaar to present us her paper, Civil Military Synergies in the EU External Action, just to see how it works also in the, on the level of the EU. And then we will have Benjamin, who will tell us something more about the effectiveness of that synergies. So Gabriëlla, please take the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. Very briefly, a little bit of the context of the research and the paper that I wrote. I work at GPAC, which stands for the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict. This is a civil society network. We are coordinating a project called WOSCAP, which was mentioned before, Horizon 2020 research project. And within that, we looked at civil military synergy specifically, as well as security sector reform and the EU's efforts in that regard. So a large part of my paper is in fact based on the findings of this research conducted by different researchers in different institutions as well. And personally, I have also a background in this area and in working on human security in Mali. So a combination of the WOSCAP findings and my own research. I looked at the different elements of local ownership and inclusivity, and how the EU's ambitions in that sense are actually implemented and found on the ground. I looked at ways how the EU could engage the civil part in a broader sense, not just civil in a civilian missions sense, but through civil society and NGOs, because they often constitute the major entry point for community engagement. So if the EU is going to do something about local ownership and be more inclusive in its policies and efforts, then this is an important part of that. I chose to focus on Mali. Why Mali is a good case? Well, it has both a civilian and a military mission of the EU currently going on. It has the EUTM, military training mission, which focuses on reforming the armed forces, and UCAP Sahel Mali, which focuses on reinforcing the government's internal security forces, such as the police. Also, there's a likelihood of the EU increasing its CSDP activities in Africa, and it's a case that also links the EU's internal and external ambitions and security concerns, so we're likely to see more of these kind of missions. In terms of methodology and analysis, just very briefly, I took a whole society approach, and this is derived from a human security agenda. So I'll briefly explain. On a horizontal axis, you have the different areas that you can look at, such as human rights, development, security, but also civil and military capacities. On a vertical axis, you have the stakeholders at different levels. So are we looking at international, regional, national, or local actors? The concept also pays attention to the role of local societies, and it refers to the ambitions of, in this case, the EU, and other policymakers to work in a more comprehensive and inclusive way, which I think is relevant for its ambitions in working towards a comprehensive approach and now the integrated approach. From that perspective, I took two main angles, so local ownership and inclusivity. Local ownership is a normative concept, which is kind of a buzzword going around, but essentially it envisages local people to control reform processes in the context of an external interventions and bringing together policy initiatives and expectations of populations in conflict-affected societies. In a way, people have started to accept this as a precondition to successful international interventions. But of course, this doesn't go without its own limitations and issues, because often what is understood by local ownership, it differs for different actors, and often it's equated with buy-in. So simply having the buy-in of the beneficiary or national government, in this case Mali, for instance, is that sufficient? And also, what is meant with local? What do we mean with local ownership? So supporting the Malian state is not the same thing as local ownership. And inclusivity, this refers to how. So how do we implement local ownership? For the actors to own the process instead of being only at the receiving end requires a degree of this inclusivity. And it's important to look at what the EU says about these aspects. The EU global strategy actually makes several important references to local ownership, and it tries to combine top-down with bottom-up approaches. So I was trying to see to what extent the EU on an operational level is able to balance the top-down and bottom-up approaches. Briefly, on the civil-military synergies, as also my colleague Katarina was talking about just now, the term is not widely used. We spoke to practitioners who said, well, I don't find it very useful, actually. We can also talk about civil-military cooperation or engagement. But essentially, what the definition I took, or the approach I took, was to look at actions and tools that can together increase the effectiveness on both civil and military sides on a strategic and operational level, and looking at a result that could have not been achieved independently by either. As mentioned, evidence is hard to find, but often it's found in the informal and ad hoc. Yeah, that makes it very hard to document. But we had a very interesting series of discussions with different practitioners from both civilian and military backgrounds. And there are examples of these kind of synergies, but it's simply very hard to document them because of sensitivities as well. And also a point I'd like to make is the dichotomy. Civilian and military is not enough. There's a large gray area when you also talk about the police or talk about private military actors, so this should also be taken into account. Within civil military synergies, I looked at security sector reform especially, because that's where it's also coming together, also in the case of Mali. I'll note some of the challenges, and then I will describe some of the opportunities as well that I identified. One of the main challenges is that, first of all, civil is not easy to engage. Who is civil? Who's part of that? Civil society also, it's kind of a jungle of organizations, and the military often don't know who to engage with. One of the key issues is trust and relationships in fostering civil-military relations. And this cannot be underestimated. This comes back in all of our findings and in all of our discussions with practitioners. For instance, you cannot just say, we should share more information because there's mistrust or questions about how will this be used, what's the level of confidentiality, can I share this information? So there's a lot in that sense. Then also another challenge is the link between internal and external security objectives. So for instance, there's a risk that there's more attention to now transnational crime, counterterrorism, migration, these kind of issues at the expense of investments in local peacebuilding initiatives. And also this might not be in line with the expectations of local populations. So this should be taken into account. Also, in terms of civil military synergies, it doesn't mean that there should be a desire, in my view, to go for integration. Because we do talk about an integrated approach, we talk about civil military synergies, but this may not necessarily be desirable to go towards integration because there are many risks as well associated with that, but I won't go into that. Another main challenge, especially for the EU, is in monitoring and evaluation. This also came out of the Mali case, where, for instance, the trainer who was responsible for training on international humanitarian law, human rights law, and against gender-based violence, etc., she was not allowed to monitor whether the training was useful because these troops and battalions were sent to the north of the country where MINUSMA had its mandate of the UN mission. So she was very frustrated because she could not test whether actually it was useful on the ground and it was producing the results that she had, the team had envisaged. Secondly, there were cases of, for instance, sexual assault by troops in Mali who have been trained by the EU mission. So then also questions arise on the accountability, because the EU says, well, these are Malian armed forces, it's the responsibility of the Malian state. But yes, but they've been trained by the EU mission. So there are also these very, very difficult questions there. And one thing as well, for instance, is the issue of revenge that came out very strongly in terms of an issue in training these troops in Mali, which is not taken into account by the EU mission. The EU mission was largely focused on a more train and equip approach, rather than really tailoring it to the context and taking into account these intangible issues, if you will, like revenge, but also that hierarchy in the military there is a completely different concept. So it's difficult for a mission of the EU to just apply a European way of training the troops. Other points from the Mali case study. We found that there's little awareness of what the EU is doing in Mali. Also many issues were found in the training provision, some I already mentioned, and it dealt insufficiently with the intangibles and it wasn't really adapted to the context, as I mentioned already. And also the short rotation of staff. This is not just from the Mali case study, but I think this is probably something that others will have found as well, is a critical issue when you're talking about relationship building and trust. There are a few ways that this could potentially be addressed, but this is a key issue, not just for the EU, but also other international missions as well. There's also an inherent tension between what I call the tangible and the less tangible dimensions of local ownership. For instance, on the one hand, you have the need to be efficient, you have the objectives of the EU, log frames, timelines, funding frameworks, and so on. And this is in contrast to the need to engage in processes that are consultative, participative, adaptive to ensure this inclusivity and develop relationships that foster this local ownership. Also, there's a tension in external interventions that focus on assisting formal institutions and structures and key components of rebuilding these institutions and their legitimacy. Some of the opportunities that there are maybe for the EU to enhance its efforts in this area are, for instance, if it wants to deepen its relationship with civil society, it can try to engage in joint community policing efforts, protection of civilians, joint monitoring and evaluation, because there are missions in different parts, for instance, in Mali, in the country, that can help with monitoring and evaluation. Civilian oversight mechanisms also are a good way that we've seen in other cases that this can be done. Planning together, and most importantly, such activities also build trust. Also in the EU global strategy already, there is a mention of investing in better shared assessments of threats, and I think this is key. So the EEAS capacities for this should certainly be strengthened. Involving beneficiaries in the planning and designing phase of missions to decrease the gap between member state priorities and local needs is very important. But this takes time, and I know that time is not often on the side of policymakers. But in some cases there are examples such as the Netherlands, who negotiated with Burundi for I think 2 or 3 years before establishing an MOU on SSR. So it is possible, but it's quite challenging. To address the large differences in skills and expertise of different EU staff in missions is to look at, for instance, involving more former staff in the training, but also focusing more on EU delegations and other institutions that are in the country for a much longer term than the CSDP missions, and putting more emphasis on a coordination and information role there. There is a good example as well I'd like to highlight from the EU UCAP mission in Mali. They have a civil society platform where they specifically engage civil society in different parts of the country on these security issues and the reform of the police and gendarmerie. So that's already a very good step forward. Yes, I'm
Okay, thank you.
just almost finished, thanks. So the main conclusions. So there is a significant gap between the EU's ambitions and policies for security sector reform and local ownership, and with how this is implemented on the ground. They focus more on the train and equip aspects and less on inclusivity, even though in policy documents this is emphasized as very important. So it's less holistic and more top-down than they have ambitioned. And this creates difficulties and a gap between also expectations by different stakeholders. These intangible aspects that I spoke of, trust, revenge, these are not just difficult for the EU to address. I think we must recognize that we should change our methodologies and approaches if we want to work on these kind of issues. And finally, I argue that only with a stronger focus on the aspects of inclusivity and local ownership, these aspects of civilian and military action of the EU will be better able to address these intangible aspects of security sector reform, and ignoring this will result in a more top-down and less effective approach. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
So Mr. and Professor Benjamin Zyla will now address the panel. So will this inclusiveness and local ownership improve the effectiveness of the EU crisis management tools? And please present us also your academic paper for this panel.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this conference and to this panel. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you also for the kind introduction. This paper I've written with Arnold Kamel. Unfortunately, Arnold couldn't be here today because Austria is running through an election, and as you know, elections in Austria are always complicated, so they need everybody in the country to help out with the election. So I will present the major findings, and it's a nice synergy, I suggest, our paper, and that is we're talking about the comprehensive approach. He has a he's involved in a Horizon 2020 project, and I'm involved in a comparative aspect of the comprehensive approach. How has it worked out, and what are some of the key lessons learned perhaps in moving forward? So we merge kind of our two interests, and this is what the results are of this paper. I'll spare you all this theoretical and methodological background. Not to say that I can't talk about it. If you're really interested in it, I'm happy to talk about it and give you some more details on those things. But I want to pick up on a couple things that my previous the previous speakers on this panel have sort of talked about. The one is I want to contextualize the comprehensive approach. Why is it that we really talk about a comprehensive approach? And by the way, I'm an academic, so there's a footnote. When people talk about a comprehensive approach, there is always a sort of problems in terms of terminology. Some people use the term comprehensive approach. Other people use the term whole of government approach. Let's just, for the sake of the argument, use the term comprehensive approach. So I want to locate the comprehensive approach that the EU, writ large, and I will come back to this in a second, uses. Why is it that we talk about the comprehensive approach? Why is it that we need the comprehensive approach? And what are perhaps some of the lessons learned from the comprehensive approach, looking backwards rather than sort of looking forward. So let me first sort of locate you into why is it that we talk about the comprehensive approach? Why is it that we need it? The comprehensive approach is embedded in a context, in a very specific context, and that context is obviously the security development nexus, or the nexus between human security on the one hand and development on the other hand. So the security development nexus is a very rich academic literature, and it tries, as I said, to merge the two interests, the hardcore, in quotation marks, security interest versus the development aspects. And that space, that civilian military space, that coordination space, is a very crowded one. If we just take one case, if we just look at, is this okay with my microphone? Something's happening here. I should just sit very straight and not move. why, just to sort of as a case example, if you just look at Afghanistan, there's over 1,300 NGOs that are operating in that country. We're not talking about the military side, we're just looking at the civilian side. So it's a very crowded space that kind of needs coordination, that needs somebody in charge, that needs perhaps some cooperation among states or civilian actors. And there's a number of problems in that regard. So the Security Development Nexus is kind of the background, and by the way, that's not new in the literature. It actually goes back to the experience that the European Union and certainly NATO had in the Balkans in the 1990s. That's where the idea came from, that's where the need comes from, and that's, quite frankly, where some of the success comes from. So that's point number one. Point number two is when we talk about the Security Development Nexus, we automatically talk about fragile or failed states. So if we just, I don't have a map in front of me, but everybody has a map sort of in his or her mind. So if we think about a map, a world map, where are some of the hot spots right now? And it is, like in every sort of human being, it's usually the belly button region. It's kind of, this is where the problematic zones are, broadly speaking. And I'm generalizing here, but these are kind of the hot spots, and these are the hot spots in the future to come. So the point is, when we talk about the comprehensive approach, we're talking about potential military civilian deployments to these kinds of regions. And if you look at the latest data from the UN and certainly from the European Union, where they have deployed their peacekeeping forces, it's that kind of belly button region that I talked about. So what is the comprehensive approach and why is it needed? And this is where it gets really crowded, convoluted. It's about coordination, it's about coherence, it's about effectiveness, it's about efficiency, because at times of shrinking budgets, states and governments, of course, want to get the biggest bang for the buck. But I would suggest that the comprehensive approach is much more than sort of efficiency, military efficiency or financial efficiency. It's about providing practitioners with a tool for conflict prevention. So the point is, it's a toolkit that the European Union certainly has, and I would suggest that the European Union, by far, is the best actor and the most capable actor in bringing the Security Development Nexus actually together, because it has a huge amount of resources, financial resources when you just look at the European Development Fund, and military resources. The problem, of course, is, as you mentioned, it's about coordination. So in theory, what is it that the comprehensive approach should actually achieve? It should create a strategic and a political sort of overarching focus. It should unite states and their efforts to create a strategic plan, to write down common mandates, goals, objectives to achieve, and above all, perhaps, and we can discuss this in the question and answer period, an exit strategy, which is one of the things that certainly did not happen in Afghanistan, which was one of the biggest problems in Afghanistan, besides that the goals were not addressed at the very beginning of it. So this brings me to the point, and it's kind of a hypothesis, is to think about this, the comprehensive approach not only as a toolkit, but as a process. It's a process and not necessarily an outcome. It's a process where actors perhaps need to work towards to, but it's not an end goal and an end state in and of itself. Most certainly the comprehensive approach, and if you look at the European Union or NATO or any other state for that matter, it provides a degree of interaction. It provides a degree of interaction among national ministries. It provides a degree of coordination with the certain types of instruments that each government has at its disposal. And it does create a certain process of formalization. But there are a number of problems with it, and I will come to those in 2 seconds. So in theory, the comprehensive approach, and perhaps to summarize that point, it should create a common mindset, a common set of understanding. It should create a process by which external actors should engage fragile states and help them to get back on their feet, in quotation marks. The comprehensive approach is also more than that. It's about creating a common understanding amongst civilian and military actors that operate in this very crowded space to do things, to understand each other. and to coordinate, perhaps. So what are some of the problems that we find from the comprehensive approach? And one of the reasons why we can't really talk about the lessons learned from a European comprehensive approach is perhaps due to the fact that the European Union tends to differentiate between civilian and military missions. There's no sort of coordinated mission where the European Union engages a fragile state with a comprehensive strategy, including civilian and military tools. So what are some of the problems, perhaps some of the key problems, because we're running out of time here. First of all, the main problem, the main weakness, whether you look at the European Union or NATO or any other member states, is that there is an inherent assumption that that essentially sort of describes that every member state has a willingness to cooperate, has a willingness to share their efforts. So that assumption is written into any sort of document that either the European Union or NATO produces. And that is simply not true. You have certain actors that are certainly willing to engage, but they're fostering and they're promoting their own national interests. So there's no common goal, and there's no common strategic objective that is sort of overarching. The second point, and if we look back to the experiences certainly in Afghanistan, one of the major obstacles to implementing the comprehensive approach effectively were domestic politics. If you want to do a comprehensive approach, you have to sell the comprehensive approach to your local societies. That is, you have to sell it to the electorate. You have to convince the electorate that the comprehensive approach is actually the way to go forward, is actually the approach that makes a difference, is the tool set that is best to achieve the objective. So you need to convince the local electorate of the comprehensive approach is certainly not happening, at least from what we can see. There's a lack of coherence, the third point. There's a lack of coherence at the strategic level. Allies did not cooperate, they did not coordinate, they did not exchange information and so forth. So there's an overarching lack at the strategic level. And I suggest that what we need is we need to move beyond simply the military realm of influence. We need to match military commanders on the ground with the civilian counterparts, which is one of the things that we don't have at the moment. So we don't have an equal civilian footing on the ground. The next point is, what really is the comprehensive approach? And if we just heard the two speakers before me speaking, we really don't know what the comprehensive approach is, and the European Union doesn't really shed much light on this. Is it a tool? Is it a mindset? Is it a common understanding? Is it a practice? Is it something that we should aim for? So is it kind of a norm? Or is it more kind of a philosophical engagement of fragile states? It's really unclear what it is. That certainly brings me to the next point, and where a lot of member states sort of differ. Is it really about integration, which, as you can imagine, there's a lot of resistance towards integrating civilian and military capabilities? Is it about cooperation? Is it about synchronization? Is it about collaboration? What really is it all about? So at the end of the day, what we need, certainly from the European Union, is a clear definition of what the comprehensive approach is and what it is supposed to achieve. And perhaps the next point, and maybe I will stop there, we'll come back to this in the question and answer period if you would like. We really need to integrate or better integrate civilian and military commanding capabilities. I talked about matching a civilian sort of commander on the ground who has sign-off capabilities and not delegating everything to the military side of the house. But moreover, we need to integrate civilian and military training and coordination. It's the military that has the resources, and it's the civilian that run around in Birkenstocks and tend to give advice to people, which of course ticks off the military because they work in a very hierarchical organization that is strict in a command and control structure. To move these two ontological worlds takes a lot of effort, but this is something that you need to overcome if you really want to implement the comprehensive approach effectively on the ground. And last but not least, perhaps there's a failure to institutionalize the comprehensive approach. Certainly if we look at the European Union, certainly if we look at NATO, and certainly if we look at the number of member states, there's no willingness to learn from the lessons of the comprehensive approach on the ground. There's no willingness to institutionalize these lessons, to formalize these lessons, and to engage future practitioners of how to do it perhaps better next time around. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor. So maybe the scope of the mission or financing is something that will determine the mission and its kind, whether it is a military or a civilian. But we will discuss it later. Now I will give the floor to our fourth panelist, and that is Mr. Cristian Barbieri. So please take the floor.
Thank you, Marina. Good morning, everyone. I'm Cristian Barbieri from Istituto Affari Internazionali, think tank based in Rome. For those who don't know, it was founded by Altiero Spinelli 52 years ago. We are leading research center in Italy. I'm a researcher within the Security and Defense program, a thematic program of the Institute. I would like to thank Sonia and BCSP for organizing such event, for inviting me, and the European Union Satellite Center for the contribution they gave to the draft of this document. This document is part of a deliverable of EU Chief Cup project, of which I'm a member. And it has been fit for this occasion. I'm open to, of course, comments and feedbacks on it. So the paper is on dual-use support to conflict prevention and peace building. What is dual use? First of all, definition, as Marina was mentioning before. Dual use technologies are tools and equipments with an innate or potential application to both military and civilian domain. For the extent of the research, I started with an analysis of the strategies and the vision of the European Union on dual use through an analysis of the document. So there are two triggers that are important speaking about dual use in the European Union. Security issue and economic issue. About security, the first document that comes out from the European Union is the European Union Council Regulation number 428 of 2008 that underlines the need for securitization of the issue. So it is a regulation on the control of the exports and transfers, brokering and transit of dual-use items. But then, after some years, already in 2012, 2013, 2014, we can find a lot of documents supporting dual-use spreading. First of all, for economic gains. DG Growth, for instance, the Executive Agency on Small and Medium Enterprises comes out with a lot of documents on EU fundings for dual use and similar documents. A lot of programs have been funded by the European Union institutions and agencies on dual use. And just to quote some of them, there is an EDA program on dual use, so European Defence Agency program. And documents like the fact sheet on European structural funds for dual use research of the European Defence Agency 2013 that say it is beneficial for security reasons. In conflict prevention and peace building, Two documents are important. The Council conclusion of December 2013 that speaks about the need for enhancement of capabilities linked to the strengthening of European defense industry. This already happened last year with the launching of the European Commission and the European Defense Agency funding for the European Defense Action Plan that will produce their effect in the next years. Another document that we have to cite in conflict prevention and peacebuilding are the Foreign Affairs conclusion of the Council of last 17th of May that underlined the need for cooperation between military and civilian efforts in conflict prevention and peacebuilding. So in the second part of the study, I analyze the two capabilities that are RPAS and satellites. Why? Because their frequency in the documents of the European Union, and because they have a clear dual-use implication. Also, they have been used in the past both by military and civilian in different ways. First of all, RPAS. RPAS are remotely piloted aircraft system. We are speaking of with this term instead of drones, because drones have a negative connotation coming from the negative use that the United States have made of them in Afghanistan and Iraq bombing, targeting also sometimes civilian, unfortunately. And we are not speaking of UAV, unmanned aerial vehicles, because they do not take in consideration the system that is around. So also training and the ground system. UAV refers just to the drone that flies. So RPAS, I'm using the NATO classification. They go from micro to the male, so different dimension, different altitude. I will not go deep with technical specification, but I will just say that they have three main characteristics: persistency, disposability, and flexibility. They have been used in military mission, especially in Africa, in Congo, for instance, and they have a strong background in the UMS, since there are several documents, but the most important one is of 2014, that it's a real Bible for using it in conflict prevention and peacebuilding occasions. In civilian mission, from interview coming from the CCPC unit, they have never been used. They wanted to be used in EU monitoring mission in Ukraine, but two main problems were arising. The first one was a political one. It was difficult to accept something flying in your sky for Georgia, and to explain to the population why this was happening. And the second one was a technical one. It hasn't been inserted in the Memorandum of Understanding. Skipping all the paper then goes deep in which kind of RPAS exist, which have been used. It's interesting, in my opinion, to read, but I will skip this part and pass through to satellite. Satellite dual use, it's a real example of dual use because it was born just as a military tool. Then since the 80s, it became also civilian. French and Italian especially are developing system like the Spot in France and the Galileo in Italy. But what is interesting to underline about dual use is that we are not speaking here about dual use of the platform. The platform is already dual, but of the availability of the service that includes Shutterstock, blackout, and the definition of the service prioritization and the lie of the service. So it's a problem of acquiring the imaging and then how this image is used, not of the platform itself. Then to cut a little bit and draw to the conclusion, we have different cluster of conclusion. Of course, a positive one, why they should be used, because they are really useful. They've been useful in military operation for intelligence gathering, for surveillance and monitoring, especially of boundaries, and so in peace agreements to check and control the definition. But when we speak of monitoring, we don't have to speak just of negative correlation of monitoring, but also positive one. For instance, they have been used by Frontex in monitoring the moving of the routes of migrants through the Balkans and in Turkey. And this can help, for instance, migrants' routes to deal with migrant routes and to help people. Also for force protection, for instance, RPAS systems have been used in force protection in the exfiltration of Italian diplomats from the embassy of Tripoli during the civil war that happened in Libya. But also for police operation, and here I'm referring, for instance, ULEX operation in Kosovo, which did not use micro or mini drones that can be useful in the searching of a person that are under an arrest warrant, especially for the orography of the territory in Kosovo. On the negative side, we have to think about the risk of leaking. There are a lot of leaks happened in Iraq, for instance, for the American RPAS. The cost effective that we need to have a little bit a more broad view on if they are really cost effective. Data protection issue, of course, because especially with RPAS, we can really check the movement of people, so it arises a data protection issue, and also the training issue. A general consideration then, and I will stop here, it's on the political remarks. As I told before, in Georgia, RPAS has not been used because political implication, but also we have to think that the mail, the bigger RPAS system, are all built by Israeli and American companies, and they need authorization by the Congress and the Parliament of Israel to be sold in Europe markets. This can be a real problem also in the transfer from military to civilian. And so it's important to continue, for instance, on the European Mail 2020 project. That is a project for a European RPAS system. Thank you. I will stop here and I open to comments.
Thank you very much. So our discutant, Mr. Pieter Feith has patiently waited for his 10 to 12 minutes. So he will address you and all of the panelists' academic papers, and he will give his comments. And also after that, we will have 50 minutes for your questions and to finish it on time. So please, Mr. Feith.
Thank you, Marina. It's lesson number one is always to try to avoid being the last speaker. If you're a practitioner, knowing that the previous speakers are academicians, because time is then getting very short. But I would like, first of all, to congratulate the authors of the excellent papers, which I have read with great interest. They have also based their findings on empiric data from case studies from missions in the field, like Mali or the Balkans. Some of the papers are not yet finalized, I think I should say, also responding to your own statements. So from my point of view, what I would like to do is to paint a little bit the strategic context against which the European Union and the CSDP are operating. My first point really is to say that we are witnessing a rapidly evolving fundamental change in the security context in the world, in which the European Union has to find its bearings and meet the challenges. We are not dealing anymore with interstate conflicts, but we are dealing with conflicts within states, pitting religious and ethnic communities with increasingly devastating consequences. We are dealing and we are seeing examples of weak governance, corruption, organized crime, leading to states becoming failed states, fragile states, falling apart. We see, unfortunately, some of these characteristics also in the Balkans, notwithstanding the efforts that have been put in since 1995. In response, let me mention this. The United Nations have called for practitioners and organizations to take a broad view of the conflict cycle. The conflict cycle and the response to the conflict cycle should start with prevention. It should start with finding the indicators for early warning, and not only for early warning, but for early action. And in this context, Cristian, I would like to congratulate you in particular on your work on the technological means to exercise surveillance, reconnaissance, and identification of developments on the ground. But I should add that these are technological instruments that complement what needs to be done on the ground, because the main indicators of tensions that potentially could lead to conflict come from society itself, from civil society, from women's groups, from grassroots communities, and they should tell us where things are about to go off the rails and lead to conflict. And I think that we are increasingly honing and improving our capacity to pick up the right signals at the right moment. And early warning, ladies and gentlemen, is important, because the number of conflicts is increasing to the point, and the amount of human and material devastation it has caused and is causing now, to the point that we cannot manage and exercise effective conflict management if we do not address tensions and situations right at the beginning. And at the end of the response to the conflict cycle, we find local ownership, because local ownership, as Ms. Vogelaar has rightly pointed out, is a key to finding sustainable solutions. It's about inclusiveness, it's about the intangibles, as she has mentioned. It is about solutions that are not only top-down, but are bottom-up. And we also have to look at solutions that increase the resilience of states to avoid them falling apart. Another characteristic which has been mentioned in the academic work is that we see external security developments that influence the internal security of the European Union and other states. I'm of course referring to terrorism, to migration, to organized crime, and also to hybrid warfare, as we have now seen in Ukraine, exercised by the Russians. And as has been pointed out by some of our academic friends, we need to strike a balance between these external security threats and the need to address them through missions on the ground and the needs of the local population. Imagine a mission in Mali working on training and security sector reform, at the same time stumbling on new attempts at human trafficking. Should it stick to its narrow mandate, or should it have the authority to step in with the capabilities it has? I would say the latter very much. It should have the flexibility to do so. But this, as we have seen in the examples, is not always the case. And finally, a characteristic of the security environment at this moment, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, is the weakening of multilateralism and the absence of United States leadership in peace building and conflict prevention. This is a relevant point because the Europe, let me call them the European armies, the military in the European Union member states, are now increasingly called upon, again, to focus on what in NATO would be called the Article 5 mission, that is the common territorial defense, and not only focus on peace building and crisis management missions abroad. And so this puts the governments in the European Union in a dilemma. What priorities should be adhered to? Can the military, with the current resources and the budgetary constraints in our countries, do both Article 5 common defense missions and continue to participate under the UN or the EU or other flags in peace building? So against this backdrop, and I could have mentioned some other characteristics, but time doesn't permit, my question is, and I hope it will also be your question, can the European Union, with all its instruments, meet the challenges that I have just tried to identify? It has been said before, next to the United Nations, under the current treaty, the European Union has a vast range of instruments: civil, military capabilities, trade and sanctions, development cooperation, mediation, and more. Well, the answer to this question from my side is not a resounding and enthusiastic yes. And I must say that having been present at the creation in 2001, when under the inspired leadership of Javier Solana, we set about to launch missions to identify procedures and to collect the capabilities of the member states. Things have changed. A large bureaucracy has now been built up in Brussels. But the original enthusiasm is waning, unfortunately. And I must say that to a large extent I share in that respect the assessment of the keynote speaker, Professor Smith. Professor Smith, yes. Because there are a number of weaknesses that we have to sadly identify, and they come also from the academic research from our friends here before you. At the Brussels level, the main weakness is the lack of political will in the capitals of the member states. Is there something we can do about it? I don't know, but it can be hoped, perhaps, if we can leave the room without getting terribly depressed, that Monsieur Macron and Mrs. Merkel will provide new inspiration and leadership in Europe, and that given the challenges they are certainly aware of, they are ready to give new directions to reinvigorating the CSDP. Secondly, we are stuck with a fractured institutional architecture in Brussels. It is not, I would say, that the Commission should be in charge of CSDP, because the Member States will never allow that. They will never allow that, and for good reasons, I would say, because the military are still part of the sovereign attributes of states, and I think there is great reluctance to delegate this to a non-elected body. There's Brexit. We don't know if our British friends after Brexit will continue to participate in CSDP missions. Are they are willing to consider that, but we don't know if the budget driven by the state of economy in the United Kingdom after Brexit will allow for a lot of extra expenditures. And finally, Member States do want to retain operational control over the contingents, military and civilian, that they make available to the European Union. And that means sometimes, and too often I have seen in my own experience, that there is a dual chain of command. There's the chain of command going from Brussels to the mission, and there is a chain of command running from the capitals to the national contingents. At the operational level, ladies and gentlemen, what the researchers have found, there is willingness to co-locate, but not necessarily to integrate. Mrs. Đokić has written, and I found this particularly relevant, that she found, quote, missing is a proactive approach to conflict prevention, unquote. And this is exactly right. I saw this in Kosovo, I saw this in other theaters where I was a mission leader and also as a civilian mission commander in Brussels. We see too little of leadership, of proactive leadership, of creativity among those who have been entrusted with the command of civilian and military leaders. In other words, it has become too bureaucratic. Ms. Vogelaar has found a gap between the ambitions and the realities of the European Union and the CSDP. Monsieur Kemmel and Professor Kemmel and Mr. Kemmel and Professor Zyla have dealt extensively with the comprehensive approach. Mr. Zyla has just explained more in detail what it is all about and the definitional problems, but in my view it remains largely aspirational. As Ms. Đokić has noted, there is still no shared analysis and no shared focus on prevention. So to round off, ladies and gentlemen, from my own point of view, 4 points, which I humbly submit for further consideration. First, I think we should change the mindset of the leadership and look at improved selection of future CSDP leaders. We should steer away from bureaucracy. We should become, I'm afraid, less risk averse. It is to be hoped that it can be avoided, but it is inevitable that in the dangerous environments where CSDP missions have to operate, that stuff can happen and that attacks will have to be expected. So one has to be better prepared. Point number 2, more delegation to the field. Give the commanders, civilian and military, the freedom, the leeway within, of course, clearly defined limits to, I wouldn't say deviate, but to go a little beyond the core mandate if required because of critical security interests that are also the interest of the member states of the European Union. Point 3, look at the chain of command. Look at the chain of command. Ever since I was in Bosnia in 1995 together with Carl Bildt, I remember Carl making a point that why shouldn't we consider putting a civilian at the top of the chain of command, over and above the military commander. And building on this thought, I would say, why shouldn't we think about an EUSR in Mali, say, or in Somalia, be at the top of the operational chain of command to give directions as necessary, and of course, after consulting with Brussels, but give directions to not only the civilian mission, but also to the military mission. I think that would bring the system a bit closer to what the United Nations is practicing, because the special representative of the Secretary General has considerably more authority than a head of delegation or an EUSR in areas where CSDP is operating. So we have to improve on that. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at the impact. If missions continue without providing any added value, but only being rolled over for bureaucratic reasons, for God's sake, put an end to it, save the resources and the money, start something that is really essential, and get on with it. Thank you very much.
So now the time has come for you to ask some questions, if you have them, so please let us know if you do. We have 10 minutes more. Yes, please.
Yes, hi, good morning. I'm Niall McNulty from the...
Sorry.
That's probably even better than I don't have to shout. Yeah?
Yeah.
There we are. I'll speak closely into it. I'm Niall McNulty from the NATO Joint Force Command HQ in Naples. Very interesting to hear this forensic analysis of EU CSDP this morning in the context of what was mentioned once, I think, in Michael Smith's presentation, the joint declaration that was agreed between the NATO and EU leaderships just over a year ago now in July 2016. Just so to come to that and to look at one of the questions that Pieter left us with, can the EU meet the challenges, in particular the new challenges, the unconventional challenges that we're facing with all the instruments it has? I suppose part of the answer to that would be yes, but not alone. And perhaps all of what you've said seems to point us towards a comprehensive approach, Benjamin, which takes us towards not only a closer civil-military coordination, but a closer coordination between all of our organizations, and including those which have sponsored this event, to actually join up better on the ground. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on how to learn from the one example we heard from Michael of success in this, which was the counter-piracy off the Horn of Africa, where all of the relevant organizations were involved and coordinated in putting an end to that totally unconventional challenge. Can we build on that to face some of the challenges that we're confronting today? Thank you.
I think the one outstanding success was the Aceh monitoring mission. Permit me to say so, but this was the European Union working together with another organization, ASEAN, Southeast Asian nations. And we managed to implement a peace agreement negotiated by Marty Ahtisaari in a year and a half, allowing peace to return to this province of Indonesia, to the great satisfaction of Indonesia and to the European Union. But this aside, otherwise I believe that the European Union and its strategic partnership with NATO and the OSCE in particular are key to effectiveness of future missions. I fully agree. As long as we don't engage in duplication, because I remember that at a certain moment NATO was considering building up a civilian crisis management component. And I thought that was a bad idea. I could understand that NATO was getting impatient and disappointed about the performance of the Europeans. European Union, but I think we should at all costs try to avoid duplication.
Professor, do you want to add something? No?
Yeah, perhaps a couple points. I've been on the record of sort of arguing that the EU and NATO should better cooperate with one another and integrate their approaches. It seems to me that NATO has the better, more efficient military capabilities because they've been doing this for the past 60 plus years. They know what they're doing. The European Union tries to match it and tries to sort of learn from previous experiences. Some of them went well, some of them didn't go so well. And the EU certainly has what NATO lacks, and that is the development side. They do have a lot of development resources, not only in terms of human resources, but also in funding and in expertise. And so if you match the two, and if you find a hybrid, let's call it like that, a hybrid sort of arrangement between those two on an ad hoc basis, perhaps that is the better solution than each organization doing things individually. In terms of the lessons learned, the question that you asked, yes, I do see this as a possible road to take. The downside or the problem I see with this is the European Union capable to do these kinds of operations in bigger missions like Afghanistan, like Libya? Is it really able to do on a grander scheme of things, do these types of operations and do well in those types of operations? I have my doubts on this. And the last point perhaps is what is clearly lacking is, despite all these efforts to cooperate and perhaps better coordinating with one another, there's no common training between even the EU and NATO, but between sort of civilian and military practitioners. They don't even share the same room. So ontologically, they're on two different worlds. They don't really talk to one another. They can't talk to one another because they assume the world is different in their mindset. So common training, common evaluation, common sort of progress through the ranks, if you want to call it like that. If you're a practitioner, if you're a military practitioner, you get evaluated differently than a civilian practitioner. And so, I mean, there's a number of sort of bureaucratic hurdles to overcome. Why not sort of, open it up and sort of think about a perhaps governance approach? I know governance is a big buzzword, but to find fluid or hybrid ways of actually addressing the issue. It's not a question of money, I would suggest. It's not a question of human resources. It's all there in the European Union. It's just a question of sort of moving people and expertise around and matching them and putting them in one room. Of course.
Yes, we have one. You want to add something?
Sorry,
Please,
is it on?
just 1 minute, because we are getting out of time. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, very briefly, just I'm happy you brought it up in answer to your question, Pieter. Can the EU address these challenges? And my first thought was yes, but in complementarity with other actors. And you spoke of the need for more multilateralism, or at least to not lose that, as this is kind of under threat at the moment. So I think this is really key. Because sometimes the EU perhaps does not have to intervene. I mean, that should also be asked. Maybe this is not a situation where the EU can, to its best potential, contribute. But of course, there are issues like competition that shouldn't be forgotten. I mean, on the ground, people who are in missions often complain about it between the different institutions. And on a final note, no one wants to be coordinated. So that's always a problem. I'll leave it there.
We have one question there.
Hi, good morning. I'm Nemanja Ivanovic. I'm coming from Pristina. So I just wanted to ask a couple of questions, mainly to Mr. Peter Feith and other guests. Can we see the improvement, or is it possible to see the improvement in EU policies and the management of the missions on the ground? Because you know very well from your practice that even there have been dissonant or different voices within the same missions. I mean, currently in EULEX, different departments are not functional. They are not talking one to another, not to speak about different missions. So I'm afraid, and is there a hope for EU to see that there is an elephant in the room to reach a common consensus that in the Western Balkans and even wider, there are very serious threats, organized crime going hand in hand with extremism, you know, because people are afraid to name it. That's my impression. People kind of tend to put these problems under carpet, because we all know in Kosovo when EULEX was supposed to come and to be deployed, we all hope finally there is an EU mission, there is a EU movement on the ground, we will see improvements. But on the end, people are now even starting commenting, oh, sorry, but UNMIC was better. So up to you, is there a hope for EU to cut the bureaucracy and have a common approach to these issues and really do fit-to-purpose movements? Thank you.
Well, very briefly, I'm too far away from it, I'm afraid. I had the opportunity a year ago to speak at an informal meeting of the PSC ambassadors in Brussels. And what I did was to raise the alarm about the situation in the Balkans. In particular, because of the developments that I mentioned, the question of bad governance, returning nationalism, the influence of Russia and Turkey. I didn't get the impression that there was any sense of responsiveness. So I'm afraid that EULEX was a bit of a failure. Should have done much better, but I was not allowed to exercise operational control over EULEX, and I had to let it go. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So at the end, I would just like to ask all the panelists, European Army, yes or no? Katarina? Benjamin?
Not sure.
Okay.
Answer you more for a yes, but
Yes.
with determined conditions, of course.
Okay. Thank you, Peter.
No, I think what we will continue to do is to see member states making available capabilities on a case-by-case basis, but not on European Army.
So thank you very much, all of you, the panelists and your participants, for the good questions and good panel, and see you later. Thank you.